This is 8 Minutes, a podcast helping you understand the energy and climate challenge in just a few minutes. I'm your host, Paul Schuster. In just 2023, China installed more solar panels than the US has in our entire history. Let that sink in. The Asian country is the behemoth player in the clean energy space, dominating everything from renewable manufacturing to rare minerals to EVs and batteries. And that dominance has critical implications for the global transition to green energy. Navigating the need for clean tech production with the geopolitical ramifications of working with China has been a challenge for policymakers in the US and Europe. Today, I'll frame the situation, discuss a bit about how China became so dominant in this space, and why that dominance is both amazing and challenging. 8 minutes. It's how long it takes the sun's race to hit Earth, or about how long it takes China to install 3.3 megawatts of new solar capacity. Enough to power over 570 homes. So yeah, they're installing a lot of renewable power over there. Let's get it on. China maintains a dominant position in the supply chain for clean energy. In just about any category of importance, China holds the top spot. The Financial Times estimates that about 90% of the world's rare earth metals come from China, 80% of all stages in solar manufacturing, 60% of all wind turbines, and a full 60% of all electric vehicles are manufactured in the country. BYD, the Chinese electric car company, sold more EVs in the last quarter of 23 than Tesla, pushing out 526,000 cars versus Tesla's 484,000. Quite simply, the energy transition is happening on the back of Chinese industry. How the country got to this point of dominance is a study in patience and careful investment. A dozen years ago, China committed itself to building a domestic supply chain on the back of clean technologies. That combination of industries in solar, electric cars, and lithium batteries has helped to displace the old trio of industries such as clothing and furniture and appliances. And while the Chinese government started to invest behind these emerging industries using subsidies to promote manufacturing, it turned out that their Western counterparts were subsidizing the energy transition in different ways. Europe, for instance, heavily promoted the growth of solar by subsidizing panels regardless of where they came from. In essence, China bet on supply while the West bet on demand. But it wasn't just the subsidies that ignited the Chinese industries. It was also a hyper-competitive, intensely cost-focused local market that drove change. A big number of firms chased the emerging space, with the weaker ones being weeded out by competition and the stronger ones surviving off a relentless pursuit of cost advantage. That ethos is something that now is really difficult for Western companies to overcome. Consider that a solar panel costs about 28 cents per watt to currently manufacture in the US. In Europe, you might be able to get that down to 25 or 26 cents. In China, try as low as 16 cents per watt. Goldman Sachs estimates that a battery factory built in the US will end up costing about 80% more than a similar factory in China and probably take 3 times as long to build. The huge investments, the learning curve, the competitive pressures on the private industries, many wonder whether the Chinese head start is simply too much for the US to overcome. But that hasn't stopped the Biden administration from at least trying. The Signature Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, emphasized not just the demand incentives to buy EVs or renewable energy, but heavily invested behind what would be needed to develop a more robust domestic supply chain, breaking the dependence upon Chinese imports for the clean transition. The IRA included robust incentives for manufacturers to use domestic facilities, domestic minerals, domestic labor. An EV with Chinese batteries could end up being $7,500 more expensive than a fully US manufactured car. The law spurred an immense amount of interest in manufacturing investment. Governing.com points out that since the IRA has been signed, 292 major new projects representing nearly $118 billion in investment have been announced. And that's incredible. The challenge? Well, some of that investment may be coming from Chinese firms. Not only does it make great economic sense for them, but Chinese firms have gotten very creative in serving the US market. Take the tariffs left over from the Trump administration that had attempted to protect U.S. solar manufacturers from Chinese imports. What did China do? They simply shifted final assembly of the panels to overseas facilities, including in the U.S. The high-value work is still done in China, but the assembly's done elsewhere to bypass the Trump tariffs. The U.S. does clamp down on portions of the Chinese supply chain, though. For instance, much of the polysilicon used in solar wafers is produced in the Xinjiang province. It's here where the Chinese reportedly rely upon a repressed population of mostly Muslim Uyghurs for labor. The U.S. and others have put firm blocks on any components coming here that contain polysilicon from that province. And, well, that represents a bit of the challenge for both China and the West in navigating the geopolitical issues while continuing to supply the low-cost components needed for climate action. Consider that of the 54 mineral commodities that the U.S. has deemed critical, not just for the energy transition, but for defense and high-tech computing, 35 of those elements are dominated by Chinese companies. A full 98% of the world's supply of gallium, for instance, is produced in China, which makes gallium an economic weapon. China, in response to the IRA and the US's restrictions on solar and semiconductor chips, suddenly restricted the export of gallium towards the end of 2022. According to the Financial Times, it was like a shot across the bow to the US, showing that China was not afraid to use their position as the supplier of the energy transition as geopolitical leverage. But that cuts both ways, too. In Europe, for instance, warehouses are filling up with solar panels from China as supply is far outstripping demand on the continent. China may be making the product, and yes, they are installing a ton on their own, but they still depend upon Western markets for much of their demand. And yet, the Chinese machine can't quite slow down as those markets mature further. The Chinese economy has become somewhat dependent upon clean energy for its growth. Carbon Brief's analysis of the 2023 Chinese economy suggests that clean energy was one of the few bright spots for the country. Clean energy investment grew by 40% in 2023, and the $890 billion invested is almost as large as the global investment into fossil fuel supply. Without that growth, the Chinese economy would have only have grown 3.0% last year. With it, 5.2%. For a country used to double-digit GDP, it's significant that almost half of your country's output is now tied to clean energy. Going forward, China will remain the leader in clean technologies. Even emerging technologies such as hydrogen are finding it hard to compete with Chinese firms. A full 70% of the electrolyzers necessary for hydrogen production are Chinese in origin. But the US, Europe, other markets are taking a hard look at the lessons learned from China's early leadership in this space. Growing domestic capabilities, building a robust supply chain, insulating that supply chain from geopolitical risks. These are all crucial elements in growing a stable global energy transition. I'm Paul Schuster, and this has been your 8 Minutes.